Mark Rivers stood at the edge of his front yard, hands on his hips, taking in the breathtaking display of colors that stretched before him. Rows of lavender swayed gently in the morning breeze, their fragrance mixing with the scent of roses, daisies, and marigolds. Butterflies flitted from flower to flower, and the soft hum of bees filled the air. To Mark, this wasn't just a garden, it was a sanctuary, a labor of love that had taken years to perfect. But his moment of peace shattered as he flipped through his mail and spotted a bright red envelope, the unmistakable mark of an HOA violation notice. He tore it open, his eyes narrowing as he read the cold, bureaucratic message inside. Notice of violation. Unauthorized landscaping. Your property is in direct violation of the Homeowners Association's landscaping policies. Non-compliant plants must be removed within 14 days, or you will face daily fines until corrective action is taken. Failure to comply may result in further legal consequences. Mark felt a surge of irritation rise in his chest. Unauthorized? Since when? He had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, and his garden had never been an issue. His flowers weren't overgrown, his lawn was perfectly trimmed, and he wasn't disturbing anyone. Yet, here was the HOA coming after him for something as harmless as flowers. Before he could fully process his anger, a sharp, all-too-familiar voice rang out from the sidewalk. "Oh, I see you got our little notice." Mark turned and saw Karen Henderson, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, standing smugly with her arms crossed. She was in her usual attire, a pressed beige suit and a clipboard tucked under her arm, the symbol of her neighborhood tyranny. Mark exhaled sharply. Of course, it was Karen. She took a step closer, her manicured nails tapping against the clipboard. "Rules apply to everyone, Miss Rivers. Either follow them or face the consequences." Mark clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. He had dealt with Karen's pettiness before, complaints about trash cans being placed out 5 minutes too early, passive-aggressive emails about holiday decorations, and even a ridiculous fine for leaving his porch light on past 10 p.m. But this was different. "This is ridiculous," Mark said, holding up the notice. "I've had this garden for years. No one's ever had a problem with it before." Karen gave a mock sympathetic shrug. "Well, times change, and so do HOA policies. We had a meeting last month, and new landscaping guidelines were introduced. You would have known if you had attended." Mark scowled. "I was out of town, and let me guess, this policy just so happens to target my yard." Karen's smirk widened. "It applies to everyone in the community, but yours is particularly excessive." She motioned to his flower beds, as if they were some kind of crime scene. Mark's patience was wearing thin. "So what exactly is the issue here? Too much color? Too much life? What? Do you want everything to look like your dull patch of grass?" Karen's face hardened. "It's about order. We can't have people doing whatever they want. Uncontrolled gardening leads to a messy neighborhood." Mark scoffed. "Messy? It's a garden, not a junkyard." Karen wasn't listening. She flipped open her clipboard and made a dramatic show of marking something down. "Like I said, you have 14 days to comply. If not, you'll be fined. $100 per day." Mark tightened his grip on the notice. He wanted to argue, to tell Karen exactly where she could shove her clipboard and HOA rules. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The HOA was a dictatorship, and Karen was the self-appointed enforcer. As she turned to leave, she threw one last remark over her shoulder. "I'd start digging if I were you." Mark stood there, seething. He glanced back at his garden, the vibrant flowers, the buzzing bees, the little oasis he had built with his own hands. There was no way in hell he was letting the HOA take this away from him. If they wanted to play dirty, he was ready to fight back. And he already had an idea brewing. If they wanted his garden gone, he'd give them a garden they'd never forget. Mark stood in his garden, his hands brushing over the soft petals of a blooming rose. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows over the flower beds. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of lavender and jasmine ground him. This wasn't just a garden to him, it was a sanctuary, a place of healing. It all started after his wife Emily passed away 3 years ago. The grief had been suffocating, an unbearable weight that made even the simplest tasks feel impossible. But one day, on a whim, he had planted a single white lily, Emily's favorite flower. As he watered it, tended to it, and watched it bloom, he found a strange sense of peace. For the first time since she was gone, he felt like he could breathe. That one lily had turned into a dozen. Then a dozen became 100. Soon his entire yard was filled with roses, daisies, tulips, and sunflowers, each one a living memory, a tribute to the woman he had loved and lost. Gardening had become his therapy, his way of keeping her close. And now, the HOA wanted to take that away. Mark wasn't the only one frustrated with the HOA's ridiculous policies. Over the years, the rules had become increasingly strict and arbitrary. No wind chimes because they were too noisy. No doormats with personal messages because they weren't uniform. No bird feeders because they could attract pests. His neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had been fined for having a small vegetable garden in her backyard. Mr. Patel was forced to repaint his mailbox because the shade of blue wasn't HOA approved. And just last month, the Smith family received a notice for having overgrown grass when it was barely an inch taller than their neighbors. Everyone in the neighborhood hated the HOA, but no one dared to fight back. Why? Because the fines could pile up fast, and if you didn't pay, the HOA could put a lien on your house. Mark had tried to ignore their nonsense before, but this was personal. He wasn't about to let Karen Henderson and her power-hungry HOA board destroy something that meant so much to him. Determined, Mark sat at his kitchen table that evening, a thick HOA handbook spread out before him. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then he'd play smart. He flipped through page after page of fine print, obscure regulations, and contradictory clauses. It was a mess, intentionally vague, so that the board could interpret it however they pleased. But then, somewhere around page 57, he found something interesting. A section titled Landscaping Guidelines stated, "Non-approved plants and decorative elements must not exceed 40% of the total yard space. Homeowners must maintain a cohesive, HOA-approved aesthetic." Mark read the sentence again, and then it hit him. They could tell him what he couldn't plant, but they had no rules against what he could, as long as at least 60% of his yard was covered in approved landscaping. So, what if he didn't just keep his garden? What if he expanded it? If they wanted to complain about his flowers, then he'd give them so many flowers that it would become impossible to ignore. Mark grabbed a notebook and started sketching out a plan. Instead of removing his beloved plants, he would plant even more. 1,000 flowers, a full explosion of color, fragrance, and defiance. If the HOA wanted him to comply with their ridiculous rules, then he would, just not in the way they expected. Front yard, covered in lilies, hydrangeas, and azaleas. Side yard, lined with marigolds and violets. Driveway border, rows of sunflowers and lavender. Even the backyard. A wild, breathtaking masterpiece of nature. The HOA wanted him to rip out his garden. Fine, he'd turn his entire property into one. And if Karen Henderson thought she could bully him into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. Mark stood in his backyard, surveying the space before him. His garden had already been a sight to behold, but now it was about to become a floral fortress. He had spent hours mapping out his plan, making sure to follow the HOA's own ridiculous rules, while also ensuring that his yard would become an unstoppable force of nature. With a smirk, he clicked "Confirm Purchase" on his laptop. Thousands of flower seeds, lilies, marigolds, violets, tulips, sunflowers, and more were on their way. By the time he was done, his entire property would be covered in a breathtaking explosion of color. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was war. As soon as Mark started working on his massive planting project, the HOA wasted no time fighting back. A fresh violation notice arrived in his mailbox the very next day. Unauthorized landscaping expansion detected. Immediate compliance required. Remove unapproved plants or face daily fines. Mark scoffed. They didn't even try to hide their desperation. He had read the rule book cover to cover, and there was nothing preventing him from planting more flowers, as long as they covered at least 60% of his yard. So, he ignored the warning and kept planting. But the HOA wasn't done. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, this time with a more aggressive tone. You are in direct violation of HOA policy. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and possible legal action. Mark crumpled the paper in his fist. They were bluffing. He knew it. And yet, their persistence made him realize just how much power they thought they had. But something else was bothering him. That evening, as he walked outside to check on his newly planted flower beds, he noticed something odd. A tiny black device mounted to a streetlight at the end of his driveway. A camera. The homeowners association had installed surveillance cameras, and not just at the neighborhood entrance. Over the next few days, Mark spotted several hidden cameras positioned along sidewalks, street corners, and even in places where no one had ever needed security before. It wasn't about safety. It was about control. He started noticing other strange things too. Neighbors whispering and avoiding eye contact when he walked past. Unfamiliar cars parked on the street, facing his house for hours at a time. A sudden spike in HOA random inspections. Karen and her board weren't just fighting back with paperwork. They were spying on him. One afternoon, he overheard Mrs. Thompson talking to another neighbor, her voice hushed but anxious. I heard they're keeping tabs on anyone who sides with him. If we say anything, they'll find a way to punish us too. Mark clenched his jaw. The HOA was trying to turn the neighborhood against him. If they couldn't scare him, they'd pressure everyone else into submission. Well, if Karen wanted a battle of stubbornness, she had just picked the wrong guy. Despite the constant pressure from the HOA, Mark pushed forward. Every day he worked late into the evening, planting rows upon rows of flowers. His front yard was now a sea of vibrant color, and his backyard was starting to resemble a botanical masterpiece. Then, one night, it happened. It was around 1:30 a.m. when Mark woke up to the faint sound of rustling outside. He sat up in bed, listening carefully. At first he thought it was the wind, until he heard the distinct snap of a branch. Someone was in his yard. He grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the back door as quietly as possible. His heart pounded as he peered through the window. A shadowy figure crouched near his flower beds. Mark's grip tightened on the doorknob. Who the hell was sneaking onto his property in the middle of the night? He slowly opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The figure froze, as if sensing they'd been caught. Mark clicked on the flashlight and aimed the beam directly at the trespasser. His breath caught in his throat. It was Karen. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands gripping the stems of his newly planted flowers, as if she had been about to rip them out. The two locked eyes, both frozen in place. Mark's voice came out low and steady. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen, for the first time, looked genuinely caught off guard. Her usual smug, arrogant expression was replaced with something else. Panic. She quickly stood up, brushing off her clothes. This isn't what it looks like," she sputtered. Mark narrowed his eyes. "Oh, really? Because it looks like you were trespassing and vandalizing my property." Karen straightened, her face twisting back into her usual scowl. "This garden is a violation of the HOA's landscaping policy. I was simply inspecting it." Mark crossed his arms. "At 1 in the morning?" Silence. Karen glanced at the street, as if looking for someone. Mark followed her gaze, and that's when he saw it. A black SUV parked at the corner, its headlights off. A chill ran down his spine. Whoever was inside that car was watching. Karen suddenly turned back to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into, Mark." For the first time, she didn't sound angry. She sounded worried. Mark took a step forward. "Then why don't you explain it to me?" Karen hesitated. Then, without another word, she turned and rushed out of his yard, disappearing into the night. Mark stood there, heart racing, watching as she slipped into the waiting SUV. The vehicle pulled away, vanishing down the darkened street. He exhaled sharply, trying to make sense of what just happened. What was Karen so afraid of? And why did it feel like this was bigger than just an HOA dispute? One thing was clear. This wasn't over. Mark couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Karen's late-night intrusion was more than just a personal vendetta. The way she had looked at him, genuinely afraid, it didn't match her usual smug superiority. And the black SUV, lurking in the shadows, had sent a clear message. Someone else was watching. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Mark decided to do some digging, literally and figuratively. He started with the HOA's official records. Most of their documents were public, accessible through the community website, but Mark knew the real secrets wouldn't be easy to find. So, he took a different approach. Mark's neighbor, Tom Willis, was a retired lawyer who had always been skeptical of the HOA's power. Over a cup of coffee, Mark casually asked him, "Ever looked into where all our HOA fees go?" Tom's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Not officially, but now you've got me interested." With Tom's help, Mark requested financial statements under the HOA's transparency clause. The board was legally required to disclose major expenses, but what they received was a sanitized version of the truth. Everything looked too clean, too perfect. But Mark had a hunch. If the HOA was truly hiding something, they wouldn't risk putting it in their official reports. They would bury it somewhere else, and that's exactly what they did. After several late nights of research, Mark found it. A small, overlooked transaction buried in the HOA's meeting notes from 6 months ago. Proposal to partner with Clarion Developments to explore future housing expansion opportunities. Mark's blood ran cold. Clarion Developments was a notorious real estate company known for aggressively acquiring land, tearing down homes, and building high-end luxury condos. They often partnered with corrupt HOAs to pressure homeowners into selling below market value, and now they had their sights set on his neighborhood. The strategy was brutally simple. The HOA would make life miserable for homeowners by enforcing unfair violations and issuing ridiculous fines. Homeowners, overwhelmed and frustrated, would be forced to sell their homes at a loss. Clarion Developments would buy up the properties for cheap, demolish the neighborhood, and build multi-million-dollar condos. The HOA board members, including Karen, would receive huge payouts for helping the deal go through. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about flowers. It was about money. Mark realized his garden wasn't the only target. As he walked through the neighborhood, he started noticing other signs of harassment. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, an elderly couple, had been fined $500 for failing to repaint their mailbox. The Patel family received an eviction warning over a non-compliant fence that had been there for over a decade. Tom Willis himself had been threatened with a lawsuit for refusing to remove a small backyard shed. One by one, the HOA was pushing people to the breaking point, and it was working. Several houses had for sale signs in their yards. Families who had lived there for years were packing up and leaving. Mark clenched his fists. Now he understood why Karen was afraid. If he had found out about this, who else knew? And more importantly, what would the HOA do to silence him? That night, as Mark sat in his home office documenting everything, he received an anonymous email. Subject: drop it. Message: you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. There was no name, no sender information. But Mark knew exactly where it had come from, and he knew one thing for sure: this fight wasn't over. Mark knew that if he wanted to take down the HOA, he had to do it publicly, where Karen and her corrupt board members couldn't twist the truth or sweep things under the rug. So he devised a plan. The next HOA town hall meeting was scheduled for Friday evening, held in the local community center. It was supposed to be a routine session where the board would discuss important neighborhood matters, code for more ridiculous restrictions, but Mark had other plans. That Friday, the meeting room was packed. Word had spread that Mark had been collecting evidence, and for the first time, the homeowners weren't there to listen to the HOA lecture them. They were there for answers. Karen sat at the front, wearing her usual smug expression, flanked by the other HOA board members. She tapped the microphone, forcing a polite smile. "Welcome, everyone. Let's begin." Mark stood up. "Actually, I'd like to start tonight's meeting with some important information about the HOA." Karen's smile faltered. "This is not on the agenda, Mr. Rivers." "Well, it should be." Mark pulled out a thick folder and held it up for everyone to see, because what I have here proves that this HOA has been lying to all of us. The room fell silent. Karen's face tightened. "Sit down, Mark. This meeting is for official HOA business." Mark smirked. "Oh, don't worry, Karen. This is very much HOA business." Mark walked to the front of the room, pulled out his laptop, and hooked it up to the community center's projector. Click. The screen lit up with screenshots of emails between Karen, the HOA president, and Clarion Developments. From Karen Henderson to Jason Cole, Clarion Developments. Subject: progress update. Jason, we've issued fines to 6 more homeowners this week. A few are already talking about selling. If we can keep the pressure up, we should have another 3 properties ready to flip by next quarter. Karen murmurs filled the room. People leaned forward, whispering to each other in disbelief. Mark turned to the crowd. These emails prove that our own HOA board was working with a real estate developer to drive us out of our homes. They wanted to make our lives so miserable that we'd sell for cheap, so Clarion Developments could buy up our properties and turn them into luxury condos. Karen went pale. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "These emails are fake. This is a setup." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" He clicked again. Next slide. A bank statement showing HOA consulting fees deposited into Karen's personal account. A woman in the back gasped. $10,000? That's where our HOA fees are going? Another man shouted. The room erupted into chaos. As people shouted over each other, Karen stood up, raising her hands. "Enough! This is all nonsense. Mark Rivers has been breaking HOA rules for years. He's just trying to get back at us." Mark smirked. "Oh, you think I'm lying?" Click. A video played on the screen. Nighttime security footage from Mark's backyard. A figure sneaking through the flower beds. A close-up shot as the flashlight illuminated the trespasser's face. Karen. On screen, the video caught her pulling flowers from the soil, her hands full of uprooted plants. The footage showed Mark confronting her, her panicked expression as she was caught. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, the camera panned slightly, capturing a black SUV parked down the street. Watching. The same SUV Mark had seen multiple times. The same people who had been spying on him. A man's voice from the back of the room shouted, "She vandalized his property! That's a crime!" Karen stumbled backward, her face turning bright red. I was just... "Just what, Karen?" Mark asked, crossing his arms. "Just proving that you'd do anything to get rid of me?" The room exploded. People started yelling over each other, demanding answers. "How much have you stolen from us? You tried to force me out of my home. You think you can get away with this?" The other HOA board members tried to calm the crowd, but the homeowners were furious. One man stormed to the front, pointing a finger at Karen. "I got a violation notice for a mailbox, a damn mailbox. Meanwhile, you were cashing in on our misery." A woman stood up, her hands trembling. "My parents lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. They sold their house last month because they couldn't take the harassment. And you were behind it?" Karen looked cornered, her face shifting between rage and fear. Then, someone pulled out their phone. A camera light flicked on, then another, and another. The media had arrived. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. A local news station had picked up the story. Soon, social media exploded with the headlines. HOA scandal, board caught colluding with developers. Community rises against corrupt HOA. Homeowners fight back and win. Karen resigned immediately, but it was too late. A full-blown investigation was launched into the HOA's finances. The remaining board members were forced to step down. The state revoked the HOA's authority, and within weeks, the association was officially dissolved. The ridiculous fines? Gone. The HOA rules? Null and void. Mark's garden? Untouched. A month later, Mark stood in his yard, watching as his flowers swayed in the breeze. His garden was still standing, brighter than ever. Karen's house, however? A big for sale sign stood in her front yard. She had lost everything. As Mark knelt down, planting a fresh row of sunflowers, he heard footsteps. It was Mrs. Thompson, Tom Willis, and a few other neighbors. "Need a hand?" Tom grinned, holding up a shovel. Mark smiled. Always. And just like that, his fight had turned into something bigger. A community. One that no HOA would ever control again. The sun shone brightly over Maplewood Drive, casting a golden glow over Mark's 1,000-flower garden. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. With the HOA officially dissolved, there were no more absurd fines, no more petty violations, and no more threats hanging over the residents like a dark cloud. Instead, something new had taken its place, a sense of freedom. And it all started with Mark's garden. On a crisp Saturday morning, Mark stood in his yard, staring at the sea of colors. Roses, daisies, tulips, marigolds. His garden had become a masterpiece of nature. It wasn't just his personal refuge anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience. Neighbors walked by, pausing to admire the flowers. Some even took pictures. That afternoon, Mark decided to throw a small celebration, a way to bring the community together. Tables were set up in his front yard, covered with homemade lemonade, fresh pastries, and small flower pots for guests to take home. A banner stretched across his porch. "Welcome to the community garden." People laughed, shared stories, and bonded over their collective victory. The same people who once feared the HOA now stood stronger than ever, knowing they had reclaimed their neighborhood. Even Mrs. Thompson, the sweet elderly lady who had been too afraid to speak up, smiled as she planted a fresh row of tulips. This is what a community should be, she said warmly. Not rules and threats, just people looking out for each other. Mark couldn't agree more, and as for Karen Henderson, her house was empty. A for sale sign stood in her yard, swaying slightly in the breeze. She had packed her things and left, humiliated and disgraced. No more power trips, no more HOA dictatorship. No one in the neighborhood missed her. As the sun began to set, Mark stood at the edge of his garden, breathing in the scent of his flowers. He had fought against something bigger than himself. He had nearly given up, but he hadn't. And because of that, his home, his community, and his freedom still stood strong. With a deep breath, he bent down, digging his fingers into the soft soil as he planted the final flower, a small sunflower, standing tall and defiant. A fitting tribute, a reminder, never back down when fighting for what's right. And with that, Mark smiled. His new beginning had just begun.